Great. All right. Well, first I'd like to welcome everybody to the first seminar in our HGen and VGI Anti-Racism and Human Genetics seminar series. So I'm really delighted to have you here and to be kind of kicking off this seminar series with a talk that I prepared and have given a couple of times now, and I'm excited to share it with you this morning. I do want to just recognize that this is a difficult topic, and just acknowledge and the degree of appreciation that I have for people coming to this seminar and being open to learning about the topic, but also discussing it with empathy and consideration for everybody's experiences, shared and unshared, that they're bringing to the table. So just to acknowledge that, and also to say, that if at times it feels like you would like to step away, take a breath, please do that, honor what you need. And the discussion and the community will be here for you when you're ready to come back. So with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. And I am going to, I think, stop sharing my video just so that I don't obscure your view of the slides. Okay. So the title of the talk is Perpetuating Harm, a study of white supremacy from eugenics to modern genomics. But to really understand the history of white supremacy in human genetics, we have to begin with understanding how the concept of whiteness really originated. And this is actually not a simple thing. This is something that historians and sociologists and anthropologists have really devoted many years to studying, understanding, and contextualizing. And so in the presentation, I'd like to share with you basically some of the research that I've done to help myself understand the political and social context for the development of race and the race concept, and how these timelines really intersected and intertwined with human genetics from its origins. And so again, just to acknowledge that we will be talking about some painful historical events, and those can be emotional. And so I just want to really thank you for staying present as we kind of explore these issues together. So here we go. All right, so the notion that human genetics, or that humans can be subdivided into classifications called races is really most saliently connected with European colonialism. And so we're going to contextualize the emergence of genetics as it came out of that era of white supremacy. And then we'll take a kind of deep dive into the history of the social construct of race and the emergence of scientific racism. And then towards the end, introduce an anti-racist framework for human genetics. So we're picking up the story with the earliest colonies of the Americas, actually. And so while 1619 is really often heralded as the first time that enslaved African descent people landed in the Americas, it's important to acknowledge that Fort Caroline and St. Augustine, which were two Spanish colonies in Florida and were founded in the mid-1500s, were actually established with enslaved Africans and Spanish forces that included both dark and light-skinned Spaniards who were free. And actually for many decades afterwards, Spain and Portugal transported Black and white indentured servants and enslaved people from Africa, most of whom were prisoners of war, into Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And Northern European colonial forces also transported indentured servants, which meant that in exchange for their voyage to the Americas, they were sold at auction and served a master for a period of time, usually somewhere between 5 to 10 years, and then were considered free. And so advertisements like these were really all over Northern and Southern Europe, from the Netherlands to Portugal and Spain. any monarchy that was basically trying to establish colonial rule in the territories in the US really needed bodies to occupy the land. So this was presented to the people in these countries as an opportunity for the poor to build a new life for themselves in the colonies. But really, from the perspective of power and privilege, this was actually a twice sweetened deal because they increased their presence in the Americas and they gained long-term servants who were doing unpaid labor at the same time. And so this population, the folks who were targeted by advertisements like this, were really essentially uniformly poor or disinherited or had been arrested for misdemeanors like defaulting on loans, and were sent to the colonies as indentured servants. So then in 1619, the Portuguese who were fighting a war with Angola captured about 350 Angolese prisoners of war who were loaded onto the San Juan Baptiste, which then set sail for Veracruz, which was in the colony of New Spain. And about a third of the prisoners died on the voyage as they approached their destination. And they were attacked by two pirate ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer. And so these crews stole about 60 prisoners and brought them to the English-held Virginia colony and traded them for food. And so this was a turning point, really, in the transatlantic slave trade, which very quickly gained popularity in the English-held colonies for several reasons. So an obvious one was that slaves were held in bondage for their lifetime, while indentured servants were eventually freed. Another reason was the knowledge of agriculture and craftsmanship that the Africans brought with them, which really significantly improved crop yields and built the infrastructure for the colonies that were being established. Another change that began to occur with the mixing of indentured servants and slaves was an increase in escape attempts and rebellions by both enslaved peoples and indentured servants. And so in the following years, there was a series of acts that was aimed at punishing runaway slaves, and in particular, aimed at discouraging indentured servants from joining forces with enslaved people. And so this is a really important theme, actually, that we'll pick up again and again. So one of these acts, an example of one of these acts reads, "Be it enacted that the English, so running away in company with slaves, shall serve for the time of the said Negro's absence, as they are to do for their own by a former act." Meaning that if they were caught, the indentured servant would add consecutive sentences to their bondage that was equal to the time that they and the slaves were absent. And so as these kind of successively punitive acts were passed, really anger and resentment towards the wealthy and powerful increased among the indentured servants. And it was boiling over among the enslaved peoples in the colonies. So rebellions began to take hold, and probably the most famous of these is the one led by Nathaniel Bacon, which burned Jamestown in 1676. And the historian Edmund Morgan highlighted the role that these rebellions had in the subsequent racialization of slavery. So indentured servants, both Black and white, joined forces with enslaved people to rebel against the power elite. And seeing the power of these groups united in a common cause really alarmed the ruling class. And Morgan said, quote, but for those with eyes to see, there was an obvious lesson in the rebellion. Resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of the upper class. Virginians did not immediately grasp it. It would sink in as time went on. And so it was during this time, really, that the racialized caste system was established. Colonies issued decrees that began to give certain privileges to the white indentured servants and increasingly racialized the slave class. And so this included, for example, Virginia's Act 8, which stated that all persons, except for Negroes, were to be provided with arms and ammunition at the pleasure of the governor and the council. And at the same time, other acts discouraged partnerships between English servants and African slaves. So another act read that whatsoever freeborn Englishwoman shall intermarry with any slave shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband. So these acts both favored the white indentured servant class and penalized anyone of that white indentured servant class for interacting with an increasingly racialized slave class. And the further acts declared that imported slaves are slaves for life, and that children born of slave women inherit their mother's caste and are also property of the master that their mother served. So the hope, of course, was that by giving white servants some new rights and creating slavery as a racialized institution, which was importantly both permanent and inherited, the chances of a multiracial alliance would decrease. And this effort worked, and the ruling class built a labor force of enslaved Africans and indentured Europeans that made the agricultural South very profitable and fulfilled their need for colonial expansion in the Americas. And so in this way, the ruling class really codified a new caste system within even the most disempowered classes. So ultimately, this powerful planter class acting to further its own economic interests deliberately brought a new form of servitude, expressly racial servitude, to Virginia. And the invention of race was actually one and the same with the invention of white supremacy. So from the mid 1600s to the mid 1700s, the racialized caste system became more and more entrenched with acts and decrees that systematically stripped enslaved and imported Africans of any human rights and legally gave whites the power to kill, rape, assault, and otherwise control the Black population. And by 1776, race was firmly established as both a legal and a social structure, recognizing the supremacy of white people and enforcing the oppression of Black people in what was going to become America. And so 1776 was, of course, notable as the beginning of the American Revolution, but it was also notable as the year that Johann Friedrich Blumenbach published On the Natural Variety of Mankind. So Blumenbach was a German physician and zoologist who described in his book 5 races, which he called Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. And he argued that Caucasian was the original race and all other races were derived from it and came about by exposure to environmental factors. And there's actually a good bit of controversy over his original intentions regarding his racial classification scheme. But really, regardless of his intent, the scheme actually quickly gave rise to what is now called scientific racism. So Christoph Meiners was maybe the most prolific and dogged of his in his efforts to establish scientific evidence, quote unquote, for a hierarchy of races with white at the top and Black at the bottom. And his widely read publication called Researches on the Variations in Human Nature claimed evidence that members of the Black race showed unduly strong sex drives, felt less pain, and were immoral by nature. So these ideas really quickly took hold in scientific and political circles at the time because they provided excellent justification for the already existing institution of racialized slavery. And just a few years after Miner's book was published, when institutionalized slavery was very much alive and well in both England and America, Francis Galton was born into the prominent Darwin Wedgwood family with a long history in science and medicine. So Galton, as many of you know, grew up to be a polymath, and among his credits, he is known as the father of eugenics. And so before we move into this chapter, I just want to pause for a minute because everything that we've covered so far was history that most of us were, exposed to at one point or another during our educations. For myself, I can say that I knew a lot of this history, but I had always been taught it and absorbed it from a white perspective. And I really had to revisit this history through a critical race theory lens so that I could understand what it really means when my sociology colleagues say that race is a social construct. And I had learned to say those words, but until recently, I don't think I really understood them at a deep level at all. The social construction of race was a tool explicitly created for structuring society. It was and still is a means to an end. It was a way for wealthy and powerful to maintain power by dividing oppressed people and turning them against each other, stripping them of their humanity and claiming the innate right to do so. And so this is what it means when we say that race is a social construct. And this power imbalance is what the European academic discipline of genetics really reinforced for the next 2 centuries. And even today, despite having to deal with race all the time in our studies of human genetics, geneticists on average are pretty ignorant about the origins of race. And there are still really pervasive misconceptions about race as a biological construct within genetics and medicine. And I think it's worth reflecting on this for a moment before we go on to talk about the role that genetics has played in reinforcing the construct. So even asking ourselves, why do we allow ourselves to be so poorly educated about something that impacts our work to such a great extent? So most of you are probably familiar and aware of Francis Galton's contributions to the fields of statistics, psychology, and genetics. So he conceptualized the idea of correlation between variables, standard deviation, normal distribution, bivariate distributions, and regression. And he was probably one of the first data scientists. He also spent the latter part of his career really fascinated with the idea that human beings could breed a, quote, better type of human. And for Galton, that fascination really developed after he read the book that his cousin, Charles Darwin, published in 1859 on the origin of species. So by then, Galton was 38 years old, and his father had recently died. He had dropped out of medical school. He had, by most reports, basically suffered a nervous breakdown. And now he was independently wealthy, kind of directionless. So he went exploring in South Africa and returned home and published a book called Narrative of an Explorer in Tropical South Africa. So he was already developing an interest in the variation that he observed across people's, across the world, really. And after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, Galton really became fascinated with linking human heredity to the variation that he observed, and actually also developing statistical methods to do so. So Hereditary Genius was published in 1886, and of it, Galton said, quote, "The idea of investigating the subject of hereditary genius occurred to me during the course of a purely ethnological inquiry into the mental peculiarities of different races, when the fact that characteristics cling to families was so frequently forced on my notice as to induce me to pay especial attention to that branch of the subject. I began thinking over the dispositions and achievements of my contemporaries at school, at college, and in after life, and was surprised to find how frequently ability seemed to go by descent. Then I made a cursory examination into the kindred of about 400 illustrious men of all periods of history, and the results were such, in my own opinion, as completely to establish the theory that genius was hereditary, under limitations that required to be investigated." End quote. So between the time that Galton went traveling in Africa and wrote Hereditary Genius, what else was happening in the world? Well, Great Britain had abolished slavery, and the United States had fought a bitter war over the American institution of slavery. American and European segregationists began to sow fears of what they called miscegenation, or interracial marriage and procreation. And in the US, there was a mad rush to enact legislation prohibiting immigration from Asia and Africa. For example, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which placed a 10-year moratorium on Chinese immigration. So by the time Galton published Hereditary Genius, he was already extremely well known in scientific circles, and by the turn of the century, he was really considered an intellectual giant of his time. And when coining the term, he wrote, "This is, with questions bearing on what is termed in Greek eugenes, namely good in stock, hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. This and the allied words, eugenia, etc., are equally applicable to men, brutes, and plants. We greatly want a brief word to express the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of man, takes cognizance of all influences that tend, in however remote a degree, to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. The word eugenics would sufficiently express the idea." End quote. So by the time Charles Davenport was hired to be the director of Cold Spring Harbor Labs here in the US, eugenics had been around for about 30 years. And Davenport brought the idea into the American Academy. Davenport was a trained Harvard zoologist who was interested in classifications and lineage. He developed quantitative standards of taxonomy and studied the inheritance of albinism and neurofibromatosis. He was very influenced by Galton, and the two of them actually corresponded frequently. And in 1910, he began the eugenics record office at Cold Spring Harbor. And in 1911, published his own work on heredity in relation to eugenics. And so the Eugenics Record Office was really the epicenter of eugenics research and policy development in the US. And it received funding from many prominent foundations and families, including the Kellogg family, the Carnegie family, and the Harriman family. And in a letter to Galton, Davenport wrote, "My dear Galton, your postcard of October 14th just received. I thank you for taking the trouble to reply. You must think me a nuisance to thus add even a letter to your correspondence, but I must tell you of recent events here. As the enclosed printed matter will show in some detail, there has been started here a record office in eugenics. So you see the seed sown by you is still sprouting in distant countries. And there is great interest in eugenics in America, I can assure you. We have a plot of ground of 80 acres near New York City, a house with fireproof addition for our records. We have a superintendent, a stenographer, and 2 helpers besides to train field workers. These are all associated with the Station for Experimental Evolution, which supplies experimental evidence of the methods of heredity. We have a satisfactory income for beginning and have established very cordial relations with institutions. And indeed, there was extensive collaboration between the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor and many of America's most prestigious higher education institutions. So Davenport hired Harry Laughlin to be the superintendent of the ERO. And their mission was to promote public policy on the basis of eugenic ideals, which included social engineering. And their organized efforts really combined with Mendelian determinism, which had taken off in the US in a big way after the rediscovery of Mendel's work, combined with their efforts really had a massive impact on popular opinion. So there were societies devoted to eugenics that began to spring up all over the United States. The Race Betterment Foundation and even the Red Cross held fitter family contests. This is a picture of one of the winning families in front of the eugenics building in Kansas. Again, funded by the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Harriman Railroad Fortune. The ERO lobbied public policy and lobbied for public policy and engaged white citizens in a grassroots way to play an active role in encouraging their government to consider eugenic legislation. And so these are 2 images from the Times. One, the image on the right is a poster that actually has little light bulbs. So that's what these large pin looking things are that flashed and said, things like every 16 seconds, a person born in the United States who is considered to be a burden on society. We can see the protesters here holding signs that say things like, I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? I cannot read the sign. By what right have I children? So Laughlin was especially effective in the domains of pushing both public policy and legislation. And so in the 1920s, he testified before the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization, providing, quote, expert testimony on the excessive insanity of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. So he argued for extreme vetting of immigrants, suggested a registry paid for by an immigrant tax. Both of those ideas are things that we have actually seen resurface in recent years. These excerpts from that testimony just highlights some of the ideas that Laughlin put forward. So for example, that every alien in America be required to register at least annually until he becomes naturalized or until he dies, leaves the country, or is deported. The registration tax might well be deferential in favor of those aliens who have made the greatest progress towards Americanization. But the total tax should be sufficient to make registry service self-supporting. This eventually led to the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924, which was primarily aimed at further restricting immigration of Italians and Eastern European Jews Africans, and actually outright banned the immigration of Arabs and Asians. Another famous act in 1924 that was not only inspired by eugenics, but was sponsored by the ERO was the Virginia Racial Integrity Act, which made it illegal for whites to marry outside of their race. And it's important to recognize that these acts were not just about racism and eugenics. They were more explicitly about white supremacy, power, and eugenics. And there were frequent loopholes in the determinations of whiteness or blackness for the benefit of the powerful. So, for example, despite this act that narrowly defined who could claim to be a member of the white race, stating that white person shall apply only to such persons as has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, they also included what they called the Pocahontas Clause, so that those with 1/16 or less of the, quote, blood of the American Indian would also count as white. And the reason for this was that so many prominent families in Virginia at the time declared some relation to Pocahontas and John Smith. And so this law wasn't struck down until Loving v. Virginia, famously in 1967. Another major effort of the ERO and academic centers working alongside them was compulsory sterilization. So 1924 was a big year in Virginia for eugenics. The next major piece of eugenic legislation was the Virginia Sterilization Act, again sponsored by the ERO and co-written by Harry Laughlin. And it gave the state the right to enforce sterilization of the, quote, feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent, including orphans, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, the homeless, and paupers, end quote. So in 1927, the Supreme Court heard arguments in the case of Carrie Buck versus the state of Virginia, which ostensibly challenged the statute. I say ostensibly because the case was actually entirely orchestrated by the defendants to establish a federal precedent for sterilization. So Carrie Buck was selected as the plaintiff, and I really encourage you to read more about her case. Of course, the court sided with the state, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is widely recognized as one of the greatest legal minds of all time, actually wrote the decision. And he famously stated that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So this law remained on the books in many states up until the late 1980s. And during this time, over 60,000 American women were forcibly sterilized, and the vast majority of them were women of color. So I think you can probably all appreciate how these events in the US and in Europe, I should mention that many European countries established similar laws, anti-immigration efforts, laws against interracial marriage, laws that allowed compulsory sterilization. I think you can anticipate how these eventually paved the way for the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and provided really the perverse justification for the genocide that took place during World War II. So academics in Germany were inspired by the US, and in particular by the US eugenic movement. And Hitler famously stated in his manifesto, quote, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of immigration are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." And indeed, the Nazi Party modeled their legislation after US laws and honored Harry Laughlin in part for his work in the science of racial cleansing. The advertisement that you see here is an advertisement for a monthly magazine called New People that reads, quote, 60,000 Reichmark is what this person suffering from a hereditary defect causes the people's community during his lifetime. Fellow citizens, that is your money too. Read New People, the monthly magazine of the Bureau for Race Politics of the NSDAP. So I think it's important at this point to highlight that not all academics or geneticists were eugenicists. Thomas Hunt Morgan, Herbert Spencer Jennings, JBS Haldane, they were among the very vocal anti-eugenicists. And G.K. Chesterton, who was not a scientist, but was a writer and philosopher at the time, famously stated, every tramp who is sulk, every laborer who is shy, every rustic who is eccentric, can quite easily be brought under such conditions as were designed for homicidal maniacs. That is the situation, and that is the point. We are already under the eugenicist state, and nothing remains to us but rebellion. And I think it is important to remember that even in these incredibly dark times, there were scientists and public figures who were attempting that rebellion. So World War II, of course, rocked every corner of the world, and eugenics very quickly fell out of favor among most of the US academic elite. So the ERO was closed in 1939, and many academic institutions also closed their departments of eugenics. However, eugenics did not disappear completely, and several academics, particularly in emerging fields of psychology and genetics, continue to claim, quote, race-based differences in intelligence, behavior, and disposition. And a lot of this work was funded by the nonprofit organization, the Pioneer Fund, which incidentally, Harry Laughlin ran after the ERO closed in 1939. So in addition to kind of damping down of eugenics in the US, several biological anthropologists began to argue that because race was socially and politically conceived, it really had no biological meaning. And one of the first people to make this argument was Ashley Montagu in his book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. So Montagu was also a rapporteur for the UNESCO statement called The Race Question, in which they described many of the problems with race. And this statement then set off a very extended debate between sociologists, anthropologists, and geneticists, some of whom insisted that race-based differences were real, and others of whom flatly disagreed. And this argument, so here's a picture of Ashley Montagu and in 1942. So this argument then continued for decades. And Frank Livingstone and Richard Lewontin were two notable geneticists who asserted that race was an inappropriate population genetic concept. So Livingstone was a biological anthropologist, mathematician, and population geneticist. And most famously, he demonstrated that the mechanisms through which endemic malaria created selective pressures on the sickle cell locus were not actually associated with race, but were associated with geographical clines and regions in the world where malaria was endemic. So he then went on to consider this more carefully and wrote this really excellent and persuasive argument in 1962 called On the Non-Existence of Human Races, which could have been subtitled Why Race Can't Be a Genetic Concept. And in it, he states, quote, there are excellent arguments for abandoning the concept of race with reference to living populations of Homo sapiens. Although this may seem a rather unorthodox position among anthropologists, a growing minority of biologists in general are advocating a similar position with regard to such diverse organisms as grackles, martins, and butterflies. Their arguments seem equally applicable to man. it should be pointed out that this position does not imply that there is no biological variability between the populations of organisms which comprise a species, but just that this variability does not conform to discrete packages labeled races. The position can be stated in other words as, there are no races, there are only clines. The theoretical analysis of clines has barely begun, but there seems to be no need for the concept of race in this analysis. So Richard Lewontin also worked in both theoretical and experimental population genetics. And he and Kenichi Kojima were the first population geneticists to give the equations for the change of haplotype frequencies with interacting natural selection at 2 loci. Their paper really gave the theoretical derivation of the equilibria expected between the two, which actually laid the foundation for Lewontin to later introduce the D prime measure of linkage disequilibrium and actually to coin the term linkage disequilibrium. And so in a landmark paper in 1972, Lewontin identified that only a very small minority of variation was actually differentiated across geographic clines. And so studies like these and others convinced many in the social, anthropological, and genetic sciences that race was not an appropriate population genetic concept, and instead that geographical clines actually demonstrated the most conceptual validity for explaining differences across world populations. But even through the 1980s and 90s, the Pioneer Fund continued to fund race-based research, some of which gained massive media and policy attention. So for example, Arthur Jensen, an academic psychologist at Berkeley, wrote extensively about racial differences in IQ testing and famously claimed that, quote, compensatory education has been tried and apparently failed. He argued that because IQ was heritable, differences in IQ testing must be due to genetics, and therefore programs like Head Start that were aimed at poorer populations, which were often majority Black, were a waste of resources. And this argument was then put forth again in 1994 in the Bell Curve. And unfortunately, these resurgences of scientific racism did affect public opinion and resources for social programs like Head Start, despite the very clear evidence of their effectiveness. And really, over the past decades, we've continually seen genetics weaponized and conflated with race, as with the example of the MAOA variant, which was claimed to be associated with aggressiveness and criminality and is found at higher frequencies in Maori tribes of New Zealand. And geneticists keep seeming to make the same mistakes over and over again. I think sometimes actually maliciously and sometimes naively. So how should geneticists talk about race and genetics? So in 2018, David Reich published an opinion piece in the New York Times in which he stated that, quote, race was a social construct, but then he went on to talk about race in biological terms. And this really garnered tremendous backlash from social scientists and some geneticists, 67 of whom published an admonishing response letter pointing out that the poor understanding of race was at the heart of this problem. And their comment really boiled down to, don't talk about it until you know what you're talking about. So this is one of my favorite images to illustrate their point. This is a picture of twin girls who share the same genetic ancestry, but they will experience very different racial climates as they navigate the world. And that is what it means when we say that race is a social construct. These girls are not an exception to the rule. They are an illustration of the rule. So when I've given different versions of this talk in the past, I often get the question, well, what should we do as geneticists? How should we handle race? And I definitely don't claim to have all of the answers, but I can tell you how I've responded to that question. First, I think that we have a lot of self-educating to do. And we can and should encourage ourselves and others to read outside of our field. There are volumes upon volumes of critical race theory, sociology, history, anthropology, genetic anthropology that many of us are just not exposed to through the course of our education. But we can change that. We can seek that literature out. And I've included here just a few of the amazing scholars in these fields who are actually faculty right here at Vanderbilt. Jada Ben-Torres in genetic anthropology, Christy Irving in sociology, Derek Griffith in medicine, Paul Taylor in philosophy, Arlene Tuchman in history. These are just a few of the faculty doing work on the history and origins of race, the relationship between race and genetics, the impact of racism on health outcomes. And so first and foremost, my advice on what we should do is to start reading their work. We can also begin thinking about the ways in which race and racism are affecting our work. Racism might be the biggest confounder that we deal with in human genetics. So it's incredibly important that we spend some time thinking about what the race variable might be representing in our work. And if we include it in analysis, devote some time and energy to explaining why we've included it and how the results should be interpreted and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So these are just a few practical suggestions, but bigger picture, I think what we really need is to develop for ourselves and our scientific communities our own anti-racism plans. Developing an anti-racist identity as a scientist takes effort, commitment, and a plan, just like we would plan any other priority in our lives. So it's really with that I want to invite you to join us for the rest of our seminars this spring. And if you're interested, to consider also taking the HGen anti-racism course next spring, where we're going to take a deeper dive into these issues and support each other as a community in developing our anti-racism plans for our academic identities moving forward. So I think I went over time just a little bit, but I appreciate your attention, and I'd be happy to open the floor for any questions.
Gosh, thank you so much, Leah. I think we have one question in the chat already. Someone wanted you to say the name of the Livingston article again, and or maybe put it in the chat for everyone.
Oh, yes. I will have to look back at my notes and find it. So give me just a second. And while I'm looking, you can add questions to the chat box. You can raise your hand. And I think, Kara, can you unmute people?
I think she didn't add me at quite the high enough level to be able to do that. I think Melinda Aldrich raised her hand, and I wouldn't be shocked if Nancy had a question or wanted to say something at this point. So I'm going to need you to do the unmuting until we get me figured out.
Okay.
Yes, and Nancy does have her hand up. You're not sure either how to do that?
I'm not finding it. I'm sorry. Nancy, can you type it into the Q&A? Let's see. Oh, wait. Wait, I found it. Okay. Nancy, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make the announcement that the VGI is creating a library of books recommended for anti-racism self-education. And so as soon as we're all in person again, anybody will be able to borrow books from that library. And I have extensive commentary from a variety of sources on, sort of where you might want to start, what's popular, what's easy, what's pretty intense, so that you can really guide yourself through some of the reading that can be that has been recommended by many of our colleagues and by by people leading the anti-racism task force and so forth. So I think there will be an opportunity, especially for students who, may not have the funds to buy all the books they'd like to here. We will have a good library for people in the VGI to be able to use.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I did find the title of that article. It's Livingstone 1962 on, and I'm typing it in, on the non-existence of human races. There we go.
And I just want to echo what Leah said. A lot of these are things, some of these arguments, were playing out as I was a graduate student. Certainly Lewontin's intensive arguments against things like the bell curve, and that was a little bit later, but there was a lot of discussion of these ideas, and but boy, seeing it all laid out this way is a intensely daunting rethink of what I thought I knew, and not just a much deeper understanding of what the United States actually meant to the development of these concepts. And that was, I think, a particularly challenging part for me, because I thought of a lot of these things as having been a heritage of European ideas, and to see the magnitude of contribution US history made to this has been really interesting.
Yeah.
Nancy, there was actually a question in the questions that's directed to you. Rebecca Abel wanted to know if we could share the list of books, because she'd like to invest in them for her own research group.
Absolutely. I'll get that onto our Slack, or we'll somehow get it to you.
Right. And Leah, you had a couple more questions pop up in chat. I think you start there at the top, or you can unmute people and ask them to ask them.
Yes. Well, now that I've kind of figured out how to unmute, I mean, I'm still slow at it, but Melinda, I think you had one. So Here we go. I've unmuted you. Melinda, I don't know if maybe you have to unmute yourself.
She does too, yes.
Okay.
If you want to go into Q&A while she's doing that, you
Okay.
could answer some of the ones that are typed out.
Okay. All right. So Jay asked, how has race persisted as a major covariate in any research, and yet the implications are so poorly understood? Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. How have we allowed ourselves as academics to do this? And to be totally frank, I think actually my response to that is it's part of the infrastructure of white supremacy that that American academia is also part of. And it has consequences like allowing white academics to go through their entire careers without asking these kinds of critical questions. So it's not an easy answer to that question. But I think it is also one that that's not set in stone, right? I mean, these are gaps that I think many people have been, painfully aware of for decades longer, and others of us are just beginning to see. And taking those blinders off, I think really provides a powerful motivation for changing the way fundamentally that we do research and that we teach research. Let's see, so Kim asked, following Nancy's information about the VGI anti-racism library, could VGI develop a widely accessible self-paced syllabus for readings, articles, and books that they recommend for anti-racism education? I think that's an awesome idea. And, you know, it might be something that we can, that we could do even kind of in conjunction with the course that we're developing, or that we developed for this year, but ended up postponing for next year because of the desire to be in person. I think that's a great idea. And I think it definitely does, the material does lend itself to a self-paced study for sure. Okay, Melinda, I don't know if you're able to jump in yet. If not, that's okay. So in the chat, Melinda wrote, racism is also prevalent against Asians and Native populations in the US. There are dimensions that we should consider here as well. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's definitely something that we also are going to be tackling within the anti-racism HGen class as well. Sarah asked, what do you envision will be some of the major changes in human genetics research when we eradicate racist thinking? Wow. That is a great question. And I mean, I think that one of the major changes will be a much deeper appreciation for the degree to which fine-scaled racism has kind of the same impacts on health and opportunity and access as, you know, blatant, overt racism does. So, for example, you know, I think that a lot of people assume that they can discriminate, or maybe that they can deal with the different environmental impacts of racism by separating individuals of European ancestry from individuals of African ancestry in their genetic analysis. And I don't think that that is true at all. And I think all you have to do is look at, for example, the relationship between the Swedes and the Finns to see that racism can exist in very fine-scaled ways. It's really about power structures and the ways in which people have been either elevated or oppressed by those power structures, and the ways in which those get tied to your outward appearance and thus tied to, you know, the genetic variation across a cline. So, so I think that what we will start to appreciate at a deeper level is that even within a African descent population, we will be looking at different levels of racism across that population. Even within what we consider to be a European descent population, we will be looking at different levels of racism across that European population. Same with Native populations, same with Asian populations. I think it's really an issue that we are only beginning to sort of scratch the surface on in genetics and to understand how it's actually impacting our work. Okay, how do you tackle anti-racism at the intersection of perceived race and culture? It's a pretty broad question, so I'm not totally sure I am following, but I think that what the individual is asking is, you know, how do you deal with the correlation between race, racism, and cultural differences or attitudes that that may coincide with those differences. I think there's no way to really deal with that effectively in the absence of data collection on racialized experiences and cultural experiences. So I think one of the, and this is also, I think, in part response to Sarah's question earlier, is that one of the big changes that we have to make is to actually begin to integrate social determinants of health into our studies. And I think that goes for both kind of the cultural piece. Many cultural elements have actually, developed over time as a response to the experiences of racism. So I think, we have to start collecting data on social determinants of health and thinking very carefully about how we integrate those, not just social determinants of health, but also experiences of racism, which we know have really dramatic effects on health. And then Shirley says, it's ironic that with such a strong racialization bias in the US, the problems that affect underrepresented minorities, maybe from geographical clines, are understudied. I totally agree. Although I don't know if it's ironic so much, I think it's kind of part and parcel of the problem, right? So it's also an effect of living in a white supremacist society, that has been our default for so long.
And Leah, in chat, you have two other questions. Kira asked about how people can be advocates moving forward as geneticists.
I think talking about these things is sort of the first step, educating ourselves, and then actually making the change to integrating what we learned into our work. So not taking the sort of easy way out of, okay, well, I'm just going to then ignore the things that I maybe have great data on, or maybe I'll just restrict my population so I don't have to deal with that problem. I think we've learned that that's not an appropriate response to the problem. And so I think actually acknowledging it and dealing with it sort of head on is a way to advocate. And definitely in discussion with our trainees, with our colleagues, these are things that we should challenge ourselves on and challenge each other on.
And then there's one from Aisha, and she uses a great example of one we don't think of as much an international perspective, Haiti and Dominican Republic, and has some other follow-up for you in there. Can you see that one?
Yes. My question is about how to communicate nuance to people in a way that gets through, because I think most of us say, quote, we addressed X in a paper to absolve us as researchers of how our research might be perceived in the general public. Yeah, I think you're totally, you're raising a really important question. And I think that it's only going to become more salient as US populations become more and more diverse within the mainland of the US, but also certainly this has been, something that's been a major focus of Jada's work, looking at the relationship between genetics and race and identity in the Caribbean. So, I think there is a lot of nuance there, and I agree. I think it would be really interesting to, begin to think about this on really a global level, which it has been a global problem from the beginning. So yeah, thanks for that, Aisha. And so we're over time. We're at a few minutes after the hour. So I think that's, Kara, did I get all the questions?
Yeah, you got all the questions. Okay. And people have asked about the recording. We did record, and we will circulate the link to the recording in all of our usual ways, Slack, email, and because this was a webinar, we will probably tweet the link as well.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you everybody for coming. This was really an honor to be able to share this with you, and I really appreciated the discussion as well. So thanks, everybody.